Welcome to Unit 7, and in Lesson 1, we're looking at estimating mentally with percent. So, first of all, I want you to write, percents are proportional. This is going to go hand in hand with Unit 6, which is using a proportional relationships to solve problems. Percentages are always going to be proportional. So I want you to write this down, please. 100% equals all of a number. 50% is a half of it, and 25% is a fourth of it. So those are some important percents to think about. Now we're going to look at finding 10% of the number 60. Okay, so how we can do that is actually a lot easier than what you think. 60, where's the decimal at in 60? A whole number. It's always at the end. So 60 is really 60.0. If we're finding 10% of a number, all we have to do is move the decimal 1 to the left. So what is 10% of 60? It's 6. We drop the decimal off because we don't need a decimal after the 6. So all you have to do is divide by 10. That's all you got to do. Move the decimal place 1 to the left. So here in the box, here, the circle, the cloud, we're going to move the decimal point 1 step to the left. When we're finding 10% of a number, we're just dividing by 10, otherwise known as moving the decimal place 1 to the left. Okay, so now let's think about this mentally. How many groups of 10s are there in 100? Well, of course, there's 10 groups of 10, because 10 times 10 is 100, right? So thinking back to our 10% of 60 problem, all we have to do is do 60 divided by 10, which is 6, right? So that's what we did here. We just moved the decimal place 1 to the left, which is also the same as dividing by 10. So now I want you to try this one. What is 10% of 83? Go ahead and pause the video and try that. All right, so if we put a decimal point after the 3 and then move it 1 to the left, what's my answer? It's 8.3. All we did was divide by 10, right? 83 divided by 10 is 8.3. And all we had to do is move the decimal place 1 to the left. Not too bad. But what if we're not finding 10%? What if we're finding 20 or 30 or 40 and so on? Watch this. So our first step is we always want to find 10% of the number. Then we can multiply or divide by the factor or the k value. You can think of it as the k value. So for example, 20% is double 10%. What about 5%? 5% is half of 10%. And so on. So you might be able to multiply or divide to find your answer. So let's try it. Let's find 20% of 60. Well, first step was we need to find 10%. So go ahead and pause the video. Try to find 10% of 60, which you already should see from the first problem. We already know the answer. 10% of 60 is 6, right? So to go from 10% to 20%, we have to multiply by 2. 10% times 2 equals 20%. So that means that 20% of 60 is 12, because 6 times 2 is 12. If we wanted 30%, we would have multiplied by 3. 40%, we would have multiplied by 4, and so on. Now, I want you to try 5% of 60. Go ahead and pause the video and try to do this one by yourselves. All right, here's your work for 5%. So 5% is 1/2 of 10%. So the answer to the 10%, which was 6, divide that by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So 5% of 60 is 3. Flip it over. All right, so on the back side here, we want to find out what 40% of 300 is. So we need to think about, how does 40% compare to 10%? So 40% to 10%. What's the relationship? 40% is 4 times as big. So we're going to be multiplying by 4. So we first need to find 10% of 300. What is 10% of 300? Well, if we look at 300, put a decimal point after the 0 and move it 1 to the left, we see that it's 30. So 10% of 300 is 30. Okay. Then we have 2. So that's our first step. Our second step is multiply by 4. So 30 times 4 is 120. That means that 40% of 300 equals 8. Excuse me, not 8. Equals 120. So from this little bubble up here, what do we do? First, we had to find 10%, and then we multiply by 4, since we were finding 40%. Now, number 4. So this is our last example. I want to show you how to estimate to find the percent of any number. So let's see. Let's find 19% of 75. So 19% is not a friendly number. It doesn't end in 0. So we don't have a strategy for that. But what can we do? We can round this up. This is super close to what number? We can say that this is about 20%. So our first step is we want to round to nearest friendly number. A friendly number ends in 5 or ends in a 0, right? So that's what we're going to do first. Then we're going to find 10%. Find 10% of that number. Then we're going to solve. So we might not be able to find 19% very easily mentally, but we can find 10%. So 10% of 75. Go ahead and pause the video and try that. So you should have gotten 10% of 75 is 7.5. And then we know how to find 20% of that number. We can multiply our 10% answer by 2. So multiply 7.5 times 2, and you get 15. So that means when we estimate 19% of a number, we're going to actually find 20%. So this would be about 15 would be our answer. All right, guys, go to complete the must-do and then complete the mastery check for 7.1.